I'm Colonel Rebecca Davis, 37, and I climbed from ROTC kid to full colonel, leading missions that brought my soldiers home. For years, I was the reliable big sister, covering, protecting, and serving while my family looked the other way. But when my mother disowned me and years later sneered, "Beggars don't belong here," at my sister's wedding, I drew a line that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you gave everything to? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. The signs were there long before she cut me out completely. I just didn't want to see them. It started with small things. The way Mom would pause when people asked about her daughters, mentioning Sarah first with that bright smile, then adding me as an afterthought. And Rebecca, of course. She's different. The word different always came with a slight frown, like she was apologizing for my existence. Family dinners became exercises in comparison. Sarah would talk about her college classes, her sorority activities, her latest boyfriend, and Mom would hang on every word. When I returned from Afghanistan after my first deployment, I felt like I was visiting a foreign country rather than coming home. Everything seemed softer, safer, less significant than the reality I'd been living for the past year. Conversations about traffic jams and restaurant choices felt surreal after months of worrying about roadside bombs and supply shortages. The gap between my combat experience and civilian concerns created a new kind of isolation, one that went beyond the family estrangement I'd grown accustomed to. Now I was separated not just from people who had rejected me, but from an entire society that couldn't really understand what military service demanded or what it gave in return. But that isolation also solidified something important: my complete independence from the need for approval or understanding from people who hadn't shared my experiences. The military had become my true family, the place where my value was recognized and my contributions mattered. I no longer felt like I was missing something essential by being cut off from my biological family. I was becoming Colonel Davis, though I didn't know it yet. Every challenge overcome, every successful mission, every soldier brought home safely was building a reputation and a sense of self that would eventually make the young woman who had been rejected by her mother seem like someone from another lifetime entirely. The knock on Sarah's apartment door came on a Wednesday evening in March, 15 years after Mom had declared me dead to the family. I was stateside between deployments, finally wearing the silver eagles of a full colonel after a career that had exceeded every expectation I'd ever had for myself. The promotions had come steadily, each one earned through competence and leadership rather than political connections or family military tradition. My fitness reports consistently ranked me in the top 5% of officers at my level. My soldiers respected me, my superiors trusted me, and my reputation in the Army was exactly what I'd hoped it would be when I first put on the uniform. But standing outside Sarah's door, I felt like that 22-year-old second lieutenant again, uncertain and hoping for acceptance from someone who might not want to give it. She opened the door, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She looked older, of course, but still recognizably the little sister I'd helped get ready for school all those years ago. Her blonde hair was shorter now, styled in the kind of professional cut that suggested stability and respectability. She was wearing a simple dress and an engagement ring that caught the light from her porch fixture. "Rebecca?" Her voice was cautious, unsure, like she was seeing a ghost. "Hello, Sarah." We stood there for another few seconds, taking each other in. I wondered what she saw. Probably someone harder and more formal than the sister she remembered, someone whose posture and bearing announced military training from across a room. I was wearing civilian clothes, but 15 years of service had left their mark in ways that couldn't be hidden by a simple sweater and jeans. "I heard you were getting married," I said finally. "Congratulations." She stepped back from the doorway, a clear invitation to come inside. Her apartment was exactly what I would have expected: tastefully decorated, comfortable, the kind of space that suggested someone who had found her place in the world and was content with it. "How did you find me?" she asked, not accusingly, just curious. "It wasn't hard." Davis isn't exactly an uncommon name, but military personnel records are pretty comprehensive. I didn't mention that I'd been keeping loose track of her over the years through public records and social media, not stalking exactly, but maintaining enough awareness to know she was safe and doing well. She offered me coffee, and we went through the awkward ritual of small talk while she prepared it. I told her a little about my career, keeping it general and positive. She told me about her job teaching elementary school, about her fiancé Mark who worked in insurance, about the wedding they were planning for June. "Mom doesn't know I'm here," I said when we'd exhausted the safe topics of conversation. Sarah's expression grew complicated. "She still doesn't talk about you. If someone asks about her daughters, she says she has one daughter, meaning me. It's like you never existed." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. They were just information, confirmation of what I'd already understood about the completeness of Mom's rejection. "I'm not here to cause problems for you with her," I said. "I know you've had to navigate that situation for 15 years, and I'm not going to make it harder." "Then why are you here?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself during the entire drive to her apartment. What did I want from this conversation? What was I hoping to accomplish by reaching out to the sister who had let me be erased from family history without protest? "I wanted to see how you were doing. I wanted you to know that I'm doing well, that I made something good out of the life I chose. And I wanted to give you this." I handed her an envelope with her name written on it in my careful handwriting. Inside was a wedding invitation, not a request for her to invite me to her wedding, but an invitation for her to attend mine if she wanted to. She opened it carefully, read it twice, then looked at me with surprise. "You're getting married?" "Next month. To a fellow officer I met during my last deployment. He's a good man, someone who understands the military life and what it demands." I paused, watching her process this information. "I wanted you to know that you'd be welcome if you wanted to come. No pressure, no drama. Just an open invitation." Sarah was quiet for a long time, holding the invitation like it might disappear if she wasn't careful with it. "She won't let me go," she said finally. "If she finds out you contacted me, if she knows I'm even considering attending your wedding, it will cause problems I'm not sure I can handle." I'd expected that response, but it still stung a little. Even now, even after all these years, Mom's disapproval carried more weight with Sarah than any desire to reconnect with me. "I understand," I said, and I meant it. "You've built a life here, and I'm not going to ask you to jeopardize that for someone who's been out of your life for 15 years. But then she surprised me. "Tell me about him. Your fiancé." So I did. I told her about David, about how we'd met during a particularly difficult mission when his engineering unit had been attached to my command. I told her about his sense of humor, his ability to find something to laugh about even in the worst situations, his unwavering competence under pressure. I told her about how he'd proposed during our last leave, how he'd understood without being told that I needed a small, simple ceremony with just our closest military friends rather than some elaborate family celebration. "He sounds wonderful," she said when I finished. "I'm happy for you, Rebecca. Really happy." "Thank you. That means more to me than you might realize." We talked for another hour, carefully avoiding the subject of Mom and the family rift, focusing instead on safer topics like our careers and interests. It wasn't the deep, reconnecting conversation I might have fantasized about over the years, but it was something. A small bridge across 15 years of silence. When I got up to leave, Sarah walked me to the door. "I probably won't be able to come to your wedding," she said quietly. "But I want you to know that I think about you sometimes. I wonder how you're doing, whether you're happy. I'm glad you came by tonight." "Me too." I hugged her goodbye, a brief, careful embrace that acknowledged both our shared history and the distance that still existed between us. As I walked back to my car, I realized that this visit had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped it would, not reconciliation exactly, but closure. Confirmation that Sarah was well, that she remembered me with some fondness despite everything, and that the choice to build a life independent of family approval had been the right one. I drove back to base that night feeling lighter than I had in years, not because I'd regained a sister, but because I'd proven to myself that I no longer needed family validation to feel complete. Sarah's life was her own to live, just as mine was mine. The difference was that I'd learned to live mine without constantly looking over my shoulder for approval that might never come. The wedding invitation arrived 3 months before Sarah's ceremony, addressed to Colonel Rebecca Davis in careful handwriting I recognized immediately despite the years that had passed. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, surprised by how much seeing my name in Sarah's handwriting affected me. Inside was a formal invitation to her wedding, along with a handwritten note that was both hopeful and cautious. Rebecca, I know this might be complicated, but I wanted you to know that you're invited to my wedding if you'd like to come. I understand if you can't or don't want to, but I thought you should have the choice. I hope you're well. Love, Sarah. The invitation itself was elegant but understated, exactly what I would have expected from my sister. June 15th at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Reception to follow at the country club, where we'd attended other family celebrations during our childhood. No mention of whether Mom knew I'd been invited, no guidance about what my presence might mean for family dynamics that had been frozen in place for 15 years. I spent weeks debating whether to attend. Part of me wanted to maintain the clean separation I'd worked so hard to establish, to avoid any situation that might reopen old wounds or create new complications. I'd built a good life without family involvement, and there was something to be said for not risking that stability for the uncertain outcome of a family reunion. But a larger part of me recognized this for what it was, probably the only opportunity I'd ever have to see Sarah on one of the most important days of her life. Whatever had happened between Mom and me, whatever hurt and disappointment lay between us, Sarah deserved to have her wedding be about her happiness rather than our family's dysfunction. I RSVP'd yes, with a note telling Sarah I'd be honored to attend and asking if there was anything I could do to help with the preparations. She called me a few days later, sounding surprised and pleased that I'd decided to come. I wasn't sure you would, she admitted during our brief conversation. I know it might be awkward with Mom there. It's your wedding day, I told her. I can handle awkward for one afternoon. What I didn't tell her was that I'd spent considerable time preparing for the possibility of seeing Mom again after 15 years. I'd practiced responses to potential confrontations, planned strategies for avoiding scenes that might ruin Sarah's special day, and made peace with the likelihood that my presence would be seen as an unwelcome intrusion rather than a gesture of love for my sister. I chose my outfit carefully. A navy blue dress that was elegant but not attention-grabbing, conservative enough to blend in with the other guests while still reflecting the confidence and success I'd earned over the years. I wanted to look like someone who belonged at such an event, someone who had clearly done well for herself, without appearing to be making any kind of statement about my independence or achievements. The morning of the wedding, I drove to the church with a mixture of anticipation and dread that reminded me of going into combat for the first time. I'd faced down insurgents and navigated complex military operations, but the prospect of seeing my mother after 15 years of silence felt more daunting than any enemy fire I'd encountered. I arrived early and took a seat in the back of the church, hoping to observe without drawing attention to myself. Guests filtered in gradually, many of them people I recognized from childhood, neighbors, family friends, relatives I hadn't seen since I was in college. A few nodded politely when they noticed me, but most seemed uncertain about whether they should acknowledge my presence or pretend they hadn't seen me. Then Mom walked in, escorted by one of my uncles, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. She looked older, smaller than I remembered, but still unmistakably herself. Her hair was completely gray now, styled in the same careful way she'd always preferred. She was wearing a mother-of-the-bride dress in pale pink, appropriate and elegant, exactly what she would have chosen for such an occasion. She didn't see me at first, focused as she was on greeting guests and accepting congratulations on Sarah's behalf. But when her gaze finally swept across the church and landed on me sitting quietly in the back, her expression shifted into something I remembered all too well, cold disapproval mixed with genuine shock. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the church, 15 years of silence and hurt hanging in the air between us. Then she turned away deliberately, giving her attention to the people around her as if I hadn't been there at all. I'd expected that reaction, had prepared for it, but it still stung in ways I thought I'd moved beyond. The dismissal was so complete, so immediate, that for a moment I felt like that 22-year-old again, desperate for any sign of acceptance or acknowledgement. But then the processional music began, and Sarah appeared at the back of the church in her wedding dress, radiant and happy, and I remembered why I was there. This wasn't about Mom and me. It was about celebrating my sister on the most important day of her life. Sarah was beautiful in the way that brides are supposed to be, glowing with happiness and excitement as she walked down the aisle toward her future husband. I watched her exchange vows with genuine emotion, proud of the woman she'd become even if I'd had no part in shaping that growth. The ceremony was traditional, familiar, exactly what our family would have chosen for such an occasion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, I applauded along with everyone else, genuinely happy for Sarah's obvious joy even as I remained acutely aware of Mom's presence several rows ahead of me. The reception was where things became complicated. I'd planned to make a brief appearance, congratulate Sarah and her new husband, then leave quietly without creating any drama. But as I stood in line to greet the receiving line, I could feel the tension building around me. Other guests were watching, clearly aware of the family history and curious about how this reunion would play out. Mom stood next to Sarah, playing the role of gracious mother of the bride while shooting occasional glances in my direction that made her feelings perfectly clear. When I finally reached Sarah, she hugged me tightly, whispering "thank you for coming" in my ear. Her new husband, Mark, shook my hand warmly and thanked me for being there to share their special day. Then I was standing in front of Mom for the first time in 15 years. "Congratulations on Sarah's wedding," I said quietly, keeping my voice neutral and polite. "She looks beautiful." Mom's response was exactly what I should have expected, delivered in a tone loud enough for nearby guests to hear clearly. "I don't know why you're here. Beggars don't belong at events like this." The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed that nothing had changed. 15 years of military service, of building a successful career and earning the respect of colleagues, of becoming someone worthy of admiration and trust, none of it mattered to the woman who had given birth to me. Around us, conversations stopped. Guests turned to stare, some with shock, others with the kind of uncomfortable fascination people have for public family conflicts. Sarah's face went pale, and Mark stepped protectively closer to his new wife. For a moment, I felt the familiar surge of hurt and anger that had defined so many of our interactions over the years. The urge to defend myself, to list my accomplishments, to prove that I was anything but a beggar seeking charity, rose up in my throat. But before I could respond, before I could let myself be drawn back into the old patterns of trying to justify my worth to someone who would never see it, something extraordinary happened. Mark raised his champagne glass and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the reception hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to propose a toast to Colonel Rebecca Davis, the hero who saved my unit in Afghanistan and made it possible for me to be here today to marry the woman I love." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye in the room turned to me, seeing me not as the disgraced daughter who had disappointed her mother, but as the decorated military officer who had saved lives and served her country with honor. And Mom, standing there with her mouth slightly open and her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips, finally understood exactly what she had thrown away 15 years ago. The champagne glass slipped from Mom's fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the country club, sending crystal fragments and pale liquid spreading across the polished surface. In the silence that followed Mark's toast, I watched 15 years of certainty crumble behind my mother's eyes. The carefully constructed narrative she'd built about her wayward daughter, who had chosen disgrace over respectability, was colliding with the reality she hadn't bothered to investigate. Mark continued speaking, his voice carrying clearly across the reception hall filled with family, friends, and relatives who had known me since childhood. 3 years ago, Colonel Davis led the convoy that evacuated my engineering unit when we were pinned down by enemy fire outside Kandahar. She made the call to risk her own soldiers to save ours, then personally coordinated the medical evacuation that got me home to propose to Sarah. I owe my life to her courage and leadership. Around us, the wedding guests began to murmur, putting together pieces of information they'd never had access to before. The girl they remembered as the difficult daughter, the one who had caused such family drama by rejecting her mother's guidance, had apparently become someone worthy of respect and admiration. Sarah was staring at me with something approaching awe, finally understanding why Mark had been so insistent that I be invited to their wedding despite the family complications my presence might create. "I never knew," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the growing conversations around us. Mom stood frozen, seemingly unable to process what she was hearing. The woman she had dismissed as a beggar, whose military service she had characterized as playing war games, was being described as a hero by the man who had just married her other daughter. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness, watching her struggle to reconcile her assumptions with this new information. Part of me had imagined this moment over the years. The vindication, the proof that her judgment had been wrong, the validation that my choices had led to something meaningful and important. But now that it was actually happening, I felt more pity than triumph. She had spent 15 years maintaining her anger and disappointment, never once questioning whether her assessment of my character and choices might have been incomplete or inaccurate. She had chosen to know nothing about my life, my achievements, my service to others, because knowing would have required admitting she might have been wrong. Other guests began approaching me, some to thank me for my service, others to express surprise and admiration for accomplishments they'd never heard about. Word was spreading quickly through the reception that the family outcast was actually a decorated military officer who had saved lives and earned the kind of respect that most people only dream of achieving. "Colonel Davis," said my Uncle Robert, Mom's brother, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "I had no idea about your military career. We should have known, should have been celebrating your service all these years." His words were kind, but they highlighted the willful ignorance that had characterized my family's response to my estrangement from Mom. They could have known about my career, my promotions, my deployments if they had wanted to. Military records aren't classified, and my achievements had been documented in local newspapers and military publications. They had chosen not to know because knowing would have required taking sides in a conflict they preferred to avoid. Mark appeared at my elbow, still holding his champagne glass, and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear him. "I wanted to do that from the moment Sarah told me you were her sister. You saved 12 lives that day, including mine. The least I could do was make sure people knew who you really are instead of whatever story they've been telling themselves." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "But this is your wedding day. I don't want my family drama to overshadow your celebration." "It's not drama when it's the truth," he replied firmly. "And Sarah deserves to know what kind of sister she has, what kind of person you've become." Across the room, I could see Mom being comforted by several relatives, though whether they were consoling her for the shock of learning about my military service or for the public nature of her humiliation, I couldn't tell. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that her assessment of my character had been so completely wrong. Sarah approached us, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hurt and confusion. "When you came to my apartment, when we talked about your career, you never mentioned any of this." "Because it wasn't about proving anything to you or anyone else," I said gently. "I didn't serve my country to win arguments with my family. I served because it was the right thing to do, because it was where I belonged. But all these years, all the things Mom said about your choices, about how you'd thrown your life away. She said what she needed to say to justify her decision to cut me out of the family. Learning the truth now doesn't change what happened then, doesn't undo 15 years of believing that I wasn't worthy of being her daughter." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, though whether they were for me, for Mom, or for the lost years between us, I couldn't say. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for not fighting harder to keep our family together, for not trying to understand what you were doing, for letting her convince me that you were the problem." "You were protecting yourself," I said, understanding finally flooding through me. "You were 20 years old when this happened, Sarah. You couldn't have fixed what was broken between Mom and me, and trying would have cost you the family stability you needed." The truth of that statement surprised me. For years, I'd carried some resentment towards Sarah for not standing up for me, for allowing herself to become Mom's only daughter without protest. But looking at her now, seeing the genuine pain in her eyes as she grappled with revelations that challenged everything she'd been told about our family dynamics. I realized she had been as much a victim of Mom's rigid expectations as I had been. The difference was that Sarah had been able to meet those expectations in ways that I never could. She had been the daughter Mom wanted, not because she was inherently better or more deserving, but because her personality and inclinations happened to align with what our mother valued. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, glancing toward where Mom sat surrounded by relatives, still looking stunned and uncertain. "Nothing has to happen," I said honestly. "This doesn't change anything unless people choose to let it change things. I didn't come here to force reconciliation or to prove points. I came because you invited me to celebrate the most important day of your life." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. Something had changed, not just for Mom, but for everyone in that room who had witnessed her public humiliation and my unexpected vindication. The story they'd all been telling themselves about the family conflict had been revealed as incomplete at best, completely wrong at worst. For 15 years, I had been the daughter who chose military service over family harmony, who prioritized her career over her relationships, who had brought shame on a family that valued respectability above all else. Now, suddenly, I was a hero whose service had saved lives, whose career reflected honor and competence, whose character had been proven under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The narrative had shifted completely, and there was no going back to the comfortable certainty of the old story. As the reception continued around us, I found myself in the surreal position of being celebrated by people who had spent years either ignoring my existence or accepting Mom's version of events without question. It was gratifying in some ways, but it also felt hollow. Their admiration now couldn't compensate for 15 years of indifference, just as Mom's rejection then couldn't diminish what I had accomplished since. I stayed for another hour, long enough to dance with Mark, to congratulate Sarah properly, and to accept the thanks and apologies of relatives who were scrambling to adjust their understanding of family history. Then I slipped away quietly, driving home through the gathering dusk with a sense of completion I hadn't expected to feel. The phone call came 2 days later. "Rebecca?" Mom's voice was tentative, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. Could we talk?" I looked out the window of my apartment at the military base where I'd built my real life, where my achievements mattered and my character was known and respected. I thought about the 15 years of silence, the absolute nature of her rejection, the completeness of her dismissal of everything I'd chosen to value. "I don't think so, Mom," I said quietly. "But thank you for calling." I hung up the phone and felt, for the first time since that terrible day in our kitchen when she disowned me, completely at peace with the path I'd chosen. Some bridges, once burned, are meant to stay that way. Some chapters, once closed, don't need to be reopened. Some families are the ones we're born into, and others are the ones we choose, and the wisdom is in knowing which ones deserve our loyalty and love. I had learned to be proud of the daughter I'd become, even if she'd never learned to love the one she'd been given. That was her loss, not mine, and I was finally free of the need to convince her otherwise. The woman who had told me I didn't belong in her family had been wrong about a lot of things. But she had been right about one. I didn't belong in a family that measured love by conformity rather than character. I belonged exactly where I was, and I had built exactly the life I was meant to live. I mentioned my ROTC training or my plans to join the Army after graduation. The conversation would shift quickly. "That's nice, dear. Sarah, tell us more about homecoming." I remember one particular evening when Sarah had just gotten engaged to her college sweetheart, a nice enough guy from a good family. Mom was practically glowing, already planning the wedding, talking about grandchildren. I had just received word that I'd been accepted into officer candidate school, something I'd worked toward for years. When I shared the news, Mom barely looked up from her wedding magazines. "That's wonderful, Rebecca. Sarah, what do you think about roses versus peonies for the ceremony?" The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that for a moment I wondered if I'd spoken at all. Sarah caught my eye across the table and gave me a small smile, but she didn't redirect the conversation. She never did. Mom had always been particular about appearances, about what the neighbors might think. My choice to pursue military service didn't fit her vision of proper femininity. She'd grown up in an era where women married well and raised children, where success was measured by your husband's career and your ability to host dinner parties. I was choosing a path that challenged everything she believed about how women should live. The comments became more pointed as I progressed through college. I don't understand why you can't find something more suitable. Teaching, maybe? Or nursing. Those are respectable careers for women. When I explained that I wanted to serve my country, that I felt called to military leadership, she'd sigh dramatically. It's just so masculine, Rebecca. What will people think? What people thought seemed to matter more than what I wanted. More than what I was good at. I excelled in my military science courses, earned the respect of my instructors, showed natural leadership abilities that my peers recognized and followed. None of that mattered to Mom. All she saw was a daughter who refused to conform to her expectations. The criticism extended beyond career choices. She'd comment on my hair when I kept it shorter for practicality, suggest I wear more makeup, express disappointment when I chose comfortable shoes over heels. "You're such a pretty girl when you make an effort," she'd say, the implication clear that most of the time, I wasn't making enough effort. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to effortlessly embody everything Mom valued. She was studying elementary education, had a steady boyfriend who came from the right kind of family, wore dresses to church, and never challenged Mom's opinions about anything. She was safe, predictable, the daughter Mom could be proud of without reservation. I started noticing how Mom introduced us to people. "This is my daughter Sarah. She's studying to be a teacher and just got engaged to the most wonderful young man. And this is Rebecca." No elaboration, no pride in my accomplishments, just acknowledgement that I existed. The extended family picked up on the dynamic too. At holiday gatherings, aunts and uncles would ask Sarah about her wedding plans, her future, her hopes and dreams. They'd ask me when I was going to settle down, when I was going to find a nice man and start acting like a proper woman. When I talked about my military ambitions, they'd exchange glances with Mom, the kind of looks that said they were all in agreement about my unfortunate choices. I tried harder for a while, thinking maybe I could find a way to bridge the gap. I'd dress up more for family events, try to engage in conversations about things that interested Mom. But it always felt forced, inauthentic, and she seemed to sense that too. Nothing I did was ever quite right. The breaking point was building for years before it actually arrived. Every dismissive comment, every comparison to Sarah, every sigh of disappointment was laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a complete severing of ties. I can see that now, looking back. The foundation of our relationship was already cracked beyond repair long before the explosion that would end everything. Mom had never learned to love the daughter she got instead of the daughter she wanted. I had never learned to stop trying to earn love that was conditional on becoming someone else entirely. We were locked in a pattern that could only end one way, though neither of us wanted to admit it at the time. The irony is that I was probably more like her than Sarah ever was. I had her determination, her refusal to back down, her strength in the face of adversity. But because I was using those qualities in ways she didn't approve of, she couldn't see them as virtues. They became flaws, character defects that needed to be corrected rather than strengths to be celebrated. Sarah tried to play peacemaker sometimes, suggesting we all needed to try harder to understand each other. But she was fighting an uphill battle against years of accumulated resentment and disappointment. Mom had made up her mind about who I was and who I should be, and no amount of mediation was going to change that fundamental disconnect. Looking back, I can see that Mom was probably afraid. Afraid of having a daughter who didn't need a man to define her success, who was willing to risk her life for something she believed in, who refused to be contained by traditional expectations. I represented a world she didn't understand, choices she'd never had the courage to make herself. But understanding her fear doesn't excuse the damage she did. The constant criticism, the lack of support, the clear preference for my sister, all of it chipped away at my confidence and my sense of belonging in my own family. By the time I graduated college, I felt like a stranger in my own home, tolerated but not truly welcomed. The stage was set for the confrontation that would change everything. All the years of tension, all the unspoken disappointments, all the fundamental disagreements about who I should be were about to explode into something that couldn't be taken back or forgiven. The end came on a Tuesday in May, 3 days before my commissioning ceremony. I had driven home from college to share the news in person. After 4 years of RODC, countless hours of training, and academic excellence that had earned me a spot in the top 10% of my class, I was finally going to become a second lieutenant in the United States Army. It was the culmination of everything I'd worked toward, the beginning of the career I'd dreamed about since I was old enough to understand what service meant. Mom was in the kitchen when I arrived, preparing dinner with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else in her life. Sarah was there too, visiting from her apartment across town with her fiancé, Mark. The scene should have been warm, familial, the perfect setting for sharing good news. "I have something to tell you all," I said, unable to keep the excitement completely out of my voice despite years of learning to temper my enthusiasm around Mom's disapproval. She didn't look up from the vegetables she was chopping. "If it's about that military thing, I don't want to hear it." The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. Sarah and Mark exchanged uncomfortable glances, but neither said anything. This was our family dynamic. Mom's word was law, and everyone else just tried to navigate around her moods. "Mom, please. This is important. I'm being commissioned as an officer this weekend. I wanted you to be there." That's when she finally looked at me, and the expression on her face was colder than I'd ever seen it. Not angry exactly. Disgusted. Like I was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "I will not be celebrating your decision to throw your life away," she said, her voice perfectly level. "I raised you to be a lady, not a soldier. I gave you every opportunity to choose a proper path, and this is how you repay me." "It's not about repaying you," I said, trying to keep my own voice calm. "It's about serving my country. It's about doing something meaningful with my life." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Meaningful? You could be teaching children, nurturing the next generation. You could be married, giving me grandchildren, contributing to society in ways that actually matter. Instead, you want to play war games with a bunch of men who will never respect you." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sarah reached over and took his hand, probably willing him to stay quiet and let this blow over like all our other arguments. But something was different this time. I could feel it in the air between us, a finality that hadn't been there before. "I'm good at this, Mom. I'm really good at it. My instructors say I have natural leadership abilities, that I could go far in the military. Why can't you be proud of that?" "Proud?" She set down her knife with deliberate precision and turned to face me fully. "You want me to be proud that my daughter is choosing to abandon everything I taught her about being a woman? That she's throwing away her chance at a normal life to chase some fantasy about being G.I. Jane?" The nickname stung because she'd been using it for years, always with the same tone of contempt. It reduced everything I'd worked for, everything I believed in, to a joke. "This isn't a fantasy. This is my career. This is my calling." "Your calling," she repeated, shaking her head. "Let me tell you what your calling should be. Finding a good man, settling down, raising a family. Contributing to your community in ways that actually matter. Not running around with guns, pretending to be something you're not." I felt something inside me snap. Years of criticism, years of feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough, years of watching her beam with pride at Sarah's conventional choices while treating mine like character flaws, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "I am exactly who I'm supposed to be," I said quietly. "And if you can't see that, if you can't support the daughter you actually have instead of the one you wish you had, then maybe I don't belong in this family." The words hung in the air between us. Sarah started to say something, but Mom held up her hand to silence her. "You're right," Mom said, her voice deadly calm. "You don't belong in this family. A daughter of mine would never choose to disgrace everything I've tried to teach her. A daughter of mine would have enough respect for her mother to listen to guidance and make appropriate choices." She paused, and I watched her face harden into something I'd never seen before. When she spoke again, her voice was final, absolute. "You are no longer my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah gasped, Mark looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and I felt something inside me break so completely that I knew it could never be repaired. "Mom," Sarah finally whispered. "You don't mean that." "I mean every word," Mom said, not taking her eyes off me. She's made her choice. She's chosen her precious military over her family, over everything I've tried to give her. Well, now she can live with that choice. Alone. I don't remember leaving the house or driving back to campus. I don't remember calling my commanding officer to let him know I wouldn't have family at the commissioning ceremony. What I remember is sitting in my dorm room that night, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring, waiting for someone to call and tell me it had all been a mistake, a moment of anger that would pass. The phone never rang. Not that night, not the next day, not ever again. 15 years later, I would realize that in that moment, she had given me the greatest gift she could have given me, though neither of us understood it at the time. She had set me free to become exactly who I was meant to be, without the constant weight of her disapproval holding me back. But that understanding was years away. That night, I was just a 22-year-old woman who had lost her mother because she refused to be anyone other than herself. Before everything fell apart, there was a time when I was the good daughter too. I was 7 when Sarah was born, old enough to feel protective, but not so old that I resented sharing attention. From the moment Mom brought her home from the hospital, this tiny, perfect thing with wisps of blonde hair and the biggest blue eyes I'd ever seen, I knew my job was to look after her. Mom was tired those first few months, overwhelmed by having 2 daughters to manage while Dad worked long hours at the law firm. I stepped up without being asked. I'd get myself ready for school in the mornings, then help get Sarah dressed and fed. I'd walk her to daycare on my way to elementary school, holding her small hand in mine, making sure she had her favorite stuffed rabbit and that her shoes were tied properly. "You're such a good big sister," Mom would say, and those words meant everything to me. I lived for her approval, for those moments when she'd stroke my hair and tell me how proud she was of how responsible I'd become. As Sarah grew older, I became her protector in ways that went beyond just helping with morning routines. When she started school and some of the older kids made fun of her for being shy, I was the one who marched up to them during recess and told them to leave my sister alone. When she had nightmares and would crawl into my bed in the middle of the night, I'd tell her stories until she fell back asleep. I taught her how to ride a bike, running alongside her in our driveway until she found her balance and could pedal on her own. I helped her with her homework when she struggled with math, sitting at our kitchen table for hours if that's what it took. When she wanted to learn how to braid her hair like the popular girls at school, I practiced on her every morning until we both got it right. Our house wasn't always peaceful. Dad had a temper, especially after he'd been drinking, and sometimes his arguments with Mom would escalate into shouting matches that scared Sarah. During those fights, I'd take her to my room, close the door, and turn up my radio loud enough to drown out the angry voices downstairs. We'd play board games, or I'd read to her, anything to distract her from what was happening in the rest of the house. "Why are they so mad all the time?" she'd ask, and I never knew how to answer. I was just a kid myself, trying to navigate the tension that seemed to fill our home more and more frequently. All I could do was make sure she felt safe, make sure she knew that whatever was wrong between our parents, it wasn't her fault. I worked part-time jobs as soon as I was old enough, babysitting for neighbors and later getting a job at the local grocery store. Most of my earnings went toward things for Sarah: new clothes when she outgrew what she had, school supplies, little treats that would make her smile. Mom always acted like this was expected, like it was natural that I would contribute to Sarah's needs, but I didn't mind. Taking care of my little sister felt like the most important thing I could do. When Sarah got interested in soccer in middle school, I went to every game I could, cheering from the sidelines even when she spent most of the time on the bench. When she made the cheerleading squad in high school, I helped her practice her routines in our backyard, tossing her pom-poms back to her when she dropped them and encouraging her when she got frustrated with complicated moves. I believed then that family was everything, that loyalty was a bond that couldn't be broken. I thought the sacrifices I made for Sarah, the way I put her needs before my own, the way I protected her from the worst of our parents' problems, I thought all of that meant something. I thought it was building a foundation of love and trust that would last our whole lives. Sarah seemed to understand that I was looking out for her. She'd tell her friends about her amazing big sister who helped her with everything. She'd ask for my advice about boys, about school drama, about what to wear to dances. We had inside jokes and shared memories that I treasured, moments of pure sisterly connection that felt more real than anything else in my life. But even then, I could sense the different ways Mom treated us. Sarah's achievements were celebrated with enthusiasm. Straight A's earned dinner at her favorite restaurant. Making the honor roll meant a shopping trip for new clothes. My accomplishments were acknowledged with a brief, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation moved on to something else. I told myself it didn't matter, that Mom just expressed love differently, that she was probably proud of me even if she didn't show it the same way. I focused on being the daughter she needed me to be: responsible, helpful, someone who could be counted on to keep everything running smoothly. The irony is that I was probably displaying exactly the kind of strength and independence that should have made any mother proud. I was resourceful, reliable, willing to sacrifice my own wants for the good of my family. I was developing leadership skills and a strong work ethic that would serve me well in life. But Mom seemed to see those qualities as problems rather than assets. She wanted daughters who needed her guidance, who would follow the path she'd laid out for them without question. My self-reliance made her nervous. My willingness to speak up when I disagreed with her decisions made her defensive. Sarah, on the other hand, was naturally more compliant, more willing to let Mom make choices for her. She was sweet and agreeable, the kind of daughter who made parenting feel successful rather than challenging. I can see now that Mom felt more comfortable with Sarah because Sarah never made her question her own choices or methods. Looking back, I realized that those early years when I was taking care of Sarah, when I was being the responsible big sister, were also the years when the foundation for our eventual estrangement was being laid. Every time I stepped up to solve a problem, every time I took responsibility for something that should have been Mom's job, I was proving that I didn't need her in the way that she needed to be needed. By the time I was ready to leave for college, the dynamic was already established. Sarah was the beloved daughter who would stay close to home and follow Mom's vision for her life. I was the difficult daughter who asked too many questions and wanted too much independence. But in those childhood moments, braiding Sarah's hair before school, reading her bedtime stories, teaching her to be brave when the world seemed scary, in those moments, I thought love was enough to overcome any obstacle. I thought the bond we were building would protect us from whatever challenges lay ahead. I had no idea that the very strength that made me such a good big sister would eventually be seen as the flaw that made me unworthy of being a daughter at all. The silence stretched for months after the commissioning ceremony, and I began to understand what it meant to be truly alone. I threw myself into my military training with the kind of intensity that people use to outrun grief. Every morning brought new challenges, new opportunities to prove myself worthy of the uniform I wore. Physical training pushed my body to its limits, leadership exercises tested my ability to make decisions under pressure, and academic coursework demanded mastery of everything from military law to tactical strategy. My fellow officers noticed my dedication, though they probably attributed it to ambition rather than the truth, that I was using duty as a shield against the constant ache of being cut off from everything I'd once called home. When others went out for drinks after long training days, I stayed behind to study. When weekend leave meant phone calls home to family, I found extra duties to fill the empty hours. The worst part wasn't the isolation itself, but the way it forced me to confront how much of my identity had been built around being someone's daughter, someone's sister. Without those roles to define me, I had to figure out who Rebecca Davis actually was when she wasn't trying to earn love or approval from people who might never give it. I started getting letters about 6 months after the commissioning ceremony. Not from Mom, never from Mom, but from aunts and cousins who had heard whispers of the family rift and felt compelled to share their opinions. The messages all followed the same pattern: disappointment in my choices, gentle suggestions that I could still fix things if I just apologized and came home, reminders that family was more important than pride. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about pride. It was about survival. Every time I'd bent myself to fit Mom's expectations, I'd lost a little more of who I actually was. The military had shown me what it felt like to be valued for my actual strengths rather than criticized for not being someone else entirely. Sarah wrote once, about a year after everything fell apart. It was a short letter, carefully neutral, telling me about her engagement party and her wedding plans. She said she missed me and hoped I was happy, but she didn't ask me to come home or suggest that we try to repair the damage. Even my gentle sister understood that some breaks couldn't be mended. I wrote back, congratulating her on her engagement and telling her a little about my training, my new assignment, the friends I was making in the service. I kept it light, positive, giving no hint of the loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm me in quiet moments. If she was going to remember me, I wanted it to be as someone who was thriving, not someone who was broken by being cast out. But thriving felt like an exaggeration most days. I was functioning, succeeding by external measures, earning respect from my superiors and building the kind of career that should have brought satisfaction. Inside, though, I was still that 22-year-old who had been told she wasn't good enough to belong in her own family. The military became my refuge in ways I hadn't expected. Here, competence mattered more than conformity. Leadership was measured by results, not by how well you fit someone else's vision of what you should be. For the first time in my life, being strong and independent and willing to stand up for what I believed in were seen as assets rather than character flaws. I started to build new relationships, carefully at first, with fellow officers who became genuine friends. There was Lieutenant Chin, who shared my love of tactical analysis and could debate military strategy for hours. Captain Rodriguez, who had also grown up in a family that didn't understand her choices, and who taught me that chosen family could be just as real as biological family. These friendships taught me something crucial, that the problem hadn't been with me. The right people would appreciate what I had to offer instead of constantly trying to change me into someone else. Mom's rejection had been devastating, but it was also information. It told me exactly what kind of conditional love I'd been fighting for all those years. Slowly, I began to see that her cutting me off might have been the kindest thing she could have done, though I doubt she meant it that way. Without the constant weight of her disapproval, without the exhausting effort of trying to be acceptable to someone who would never accept me, I had space to discover what I was actually capable of accomplishing. My performance evaluations were consistently excellent. I was selected for advanced training programs, recommended for leadership positions that typically went to officers with more experience. Word got around that Davis was someone you wanted on your team, someone who could be trusted to get the job done and take care of the people under her command. But success felt hollow when I had no one to share it with. I would get promoted or receive commendations, and my first impulse would still be to call home and tell Mom and Sarah the good news. Then I'd remember that home wasn't there anymore, at least not for me. The grief came in waves, sometimes triggered by the smallest things. Seeing other officers with their families at military ceremonies, hearing someone laugh in a way that reminded me of Sarah, catching a scent that brought back memories of Mom's cooking. I learned to ride out these moments without letting them derail me, but they never stopped happening entirely. What sustained me was the growing realization that I was building something new, something that belonged entirely to me. Every challenge I met, every obstacle I overcame, every moment when I proved that I could be trusted with responsibility and leadership, all of it was creating a foundation that no one could take away from me. I wasn't the daughter my mother had wanted, and I was finally beginning to understand that this was her loss, not mine. The version of me that would have fit her expectations would have been smaller, safer, less capable of the things I was discovering I could do. Some nights, I'd lie in my bunk and imagine what it would be like if things had been different, if she had been able to love the daughter she got instead of mourning the one she'd wanted. But those thoughts were becoming less painful and more academic, like wondering about a book you'd never read rather than grieving for a story you'd lost. I was learning to be proud of myself, to find satisfaction in my own approval rather than constantly seeking it from others. It was a harder path than I'd expected, lonelier than I'd wanted, but it was mine in a way that my old life had never been. The military was teaching me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you fight to become yourself. By the time I'd been in the service for 5 years, I'd made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I was done trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth loving. The decision didn't come all at once. It was built from countless small moments, letters from family members that I read once and then filed away without answering, invitations to events that I politely declined, phone calls I didn't make on birthdays and holidays. Each choice to step back, to stop reaching out, was a small act of self-preservation that gradually hardened into something more permanent. The final straw came when my cousin Jennifer called to tell me that Mom had been in a car accident. Nothing serious, she assured me quickly, just a fender bender that left her shaken and with some minor injuries. But Jennifer thought I should know, should maybe send flowers or a card, should make some gesture that might open the door to reconciliation. She's not getting any younger, Rebecca, Jennifer said, using the gentle tone people reserve for delivering uncomfortable truths. And you know she's proud of you, even if she doesn't know how to say it. Maybe this could be a chance to rebuild things. I listened to the whole speech, thanked Jennifer for calling, and then hung up without making any promises. I didn't send flowers. I didn't write a card. I felt a moment of concern for Mom's well-being, the way you might worry about any person who'd been hurt, but I didn't feel the desperate pull to fix things that I might have expected. That's when I knew something fundamental had changed inside me. The part of me that had spent years trying to prove I was worthy of her love had finally died, replaced by something steadier and more self-contained. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't hurt in the sharp, immediate way that had characterized those first few years of separation. I was just done. I turned my full attention to my military career with a clarity of purpose that surprised even me. Without the distraction of trying to manage family relationships, without the emotional energy drain of constantly wondering if this would be the day someone reached out to repair the damage, I could focus entirely on becoming the best officer I could be. The results were immediate and noticeable. I volunteered for difficult assignments that other officers avoided. I took on leadership roles in challenging situations where failure meant more than just personal disappointment, it meant putting soldiers at risk. I studied tactics and strategy with the intensity of someone who understood that competence could mean the difference between life and death for the people under my command. My superiors began to see me as someone who could be trusted with increasing levels of responsibility. I was promoted ahead of schedule, selected for advanced training programs, recommended for positions that typically went to officers with more experience or better connections. What I lacked in political savvy or family military tradition, I made up for with sheer competence and unwavering dedication. But it wasn't just professional success that marked this period. It was the development of what I can only call emotional armor, a protective shell that allowed me to function at full capacity without being constantly vulnerable to rejection or disapproval. I learned to find satisfaction in my own assessment of my performance rather than seeking validation from others. This transformation wasn't without cost. There were times when other officers or friends would comment on my intensity, my reluctance to share personal details, my tendency to deflect attempts at deeper intimacy with humor or by redirecting conversation to work topics. I was becoming someone who was easier to respect than to love, more reliable than approachable. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to contort myself into someone else's vision of who I should be. The military valued exactly the qualities that had made me unsuitable as a daughter: independence, resilience, the ability to make hard decisions without constantly seeking approval or reassurance. When other officers talked about their families during downtime, I would listen politely but rarely contributed my own stories. When holidays rolled around and everyone else made plans to visit home, I would volunteer for duty rotations that kept me on base. My colleagues began to see me as someone who was married to the job, completely devoted to the service in a way that left little room for anything else. They weren't entirely wrong. The military had become more than my career. It was my identity, my community, my source of meaning and purpose. The structure and hierarchy provided the kind of clear expectations I'd never had growing up. Success was measured by objective standards: mission completion, soldier welfare, tactical effectiveness. There was no guesswork about whether I was doing well or disappointing someone with my choices. Letters from family members became increasingly infrequent as they realized I wasn't going to respond to their attempts at reconciliation. The silence that had once felt like punishment began to feel like freedom. I wasn't walking on eggshells, wasn't constantly monitoring my words and actions for signs of disapproval, wasn't living with the low-level anxiety that had characterized my relationship with Mom for as long as I could remember. Instead, I was building something entirely my own. Every promotion, every commendation, every successful mission was proof that I had value that existed independent of family approval. The respect I earned from fellow soldiers, the trust placed in me by superior officers, the knowledge that I was making a difference in the lives of the people I led, all of it created a foundation of self-worth that no one could take away from me. By the end of my 5th year in service, I had become someone I might not have recognized as that 22-year-old who had been told she was no longer worthy of being called daughter. I was harder, more self-contained, less interested in pleasing others, and more focused on achieving objectives that mattered to me. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my adult life, that dignity and self-respect were not gifts that others could give or take away, but qualities I could choose to cultivate regardless of how others treated me. The decision to stop chasing approval hadn't made me bitter or cynical. It had made me free. Afghanistan changed everything, though it would take years for me to fully understand how. I deployed as a captain leading a logistics company, responsible for keeping supply lines open between forward operating bases in some of the most dangerous territory in the country. The work was unglamorous, but critical. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, mail from home, all of it had to move through areas where improvised explosive devices and ambush attacks were daily realities. The soldiers under my command were a mix of seasoned veterans and kids barely out of basic training, united only by their dependence on me to make decisions that would bring them home alive. Some were college graduates who had joined for the same reasons I had, a sense of duty, a desire to serve something larger than themselves. Others were small-town kids for whom the military was the best available path to stable employment and educational opportunities. What they all had in common was that they looked to me for leadership in situations where leadership meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, between coming home with everyone who deployed and leaving people behind in flag-draped coffins. The weight of that responsibility was unlike anything I'd experienced in garrison duty back home. Every convoy route had to be analyzed for potential threats. Every decision about timing, personnel assignments, and equipment loadouts carried life-or-death consequences. There was no margin for error, no opportunity to learn from mistakes if those mistakes resulted in casualties. I discovered I had a talent for this kind of pressure. Where some officers became paralyzed by the enormity of their responsibilities, I found a kind of clarity that surprised even me. I could assess threats quickly, make decisions with incomplete information, and maintain focus in chaotic situations that left others struggling to function effectively. My soldiers began to trust me in ways that went beyond standard military hierarchy. They could see that I wasn't making decisions from behind a desk or based on theoretical knowledge from staff college courses. I was right there with them, sharing the same risks, eating the same food, sleeping in the same conditions, facing the same dangers that threatened them every day. The first time we took casualties, I thought I might break. It was a routine supply run that turned deadly when our lead vehicle hit an IED planted in what had been a safe route the day before. Specialist Morrison, barely 20 years old, lost his leg below the knee. Sergeant Williams suffered a traumatic brain injury that would end his career and change his life forever. I sat in the medical tent that night, watching medics work to stabilize Williams for evacuation, and felt the full weight of command in a way that no training exercise could have prepared me for. These weren't statistics or theoretical problems to be solved. They were real people who had trusted me to bring them home safe, and I had failed them. But failure in combat isn't the same as failure in civilian life. You don't have the luxury of falling apart or questioning every decision. You have to learn from what went wrong, adjust your tactics accordingly, and get back out there the next day with the same soldiers who are watching to see if you're still worthy of their trust. Over the course of that deployment, I learned things about leadership and about myself that no textbook could have taught. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the ability to function effectively despite being terrified. I learned that taking care of soldiers means making hard decisions they might not understand or appreciate, but that keep them alive to complain about your leadership style later. Most importantly, I learned that I was capable of handling responsibility and pressure in ways that surprised everyone, including me. My fitness reports were outstanding. My soldiers re-enlisted at higher rates than typical, and several specifically requested to serve under my command again in future deployments. But success came at a cost. The hypervigilance required for combat operations didn't shut off when I returned to base. The emotional walls I'd built to maintain focus under fire didn't come down easily during quieter moments. I found myself becoming even more self-contained, more reluctant to show vulnerability or uncertainty, more comfortable with solitude than with the messy complications of close relationships. The few times I called friends or colleagues back home, I struggled to relate to their concerns about office politics or weekend plans. Their problems seemed trivial compared to the life-and-death decisions I was making every day. My problems, watching soldiers get injured or killed, dealing with equipment failures in hostile territory, maintaining morale under impossible conditions, were things they couldn't really understand unless they'd been there themselves. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a backbone today, and drop your thoughts below. Questions for you. Have you ever faced a public put-down from family? How did you respond in the moment? If you were me, would you have attended the wedding or stayed away? What boundary are you setting this year that you won't apologize for? Did your family ever come around after a major rift, or did you choose peace from a distance? What's one thing you wish you'd said in a moment like this? I'm reading the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and your story.